Hi there. I'm Rick Miller. I'm the Director of Elementary Teaching, Learning, and Equity. Thanks for taking time to view this screencast where we're going to be talking with you about our process and some background and history related to creating the Sun Prairie School District Instructional Framework. In this slide presentation, we will be sharing with you, again, overview and history of an instructional framework, why we have one, what it is, and our journey to creating an instructional framework with a visual representation of what we believe matters most in teaching and learning. And then we'll talk about entry points and next steps in applying this information. All right, so why have a common instructional framework? So there's a body of research that says that school districts that are able to do the best work and get the best results for kids do some things in common. And the school districts who don't get the best outcomes for kids also have some things in common. And those are listed here. For example, less coherent schools did not seek to organize their instructional programs around a common instructional framework. So the coherence of schools is directly connected to outcomes for kids. Higher rated schools use a core set of strategies to harness available resources and staff and focus their energy on a vital few things. And so this slide gives more information about why instructional framework really does connect to improve student outcomes. On the next slide, this is our summary of why to have a common instructional framework. A common instructional framework will lead to a coherent instructional program across the school district that will reduce or eliminate disproportionality in student achievement outcomes for our Black, Brown, and other historically marginalized students. So this is our theory of action. Based on the research that was cited on the previous slide, that if we do this work well, that we'll see improvement for all. And if we see that improvement for our Black, Brown, and other historically marginalized students, that will also benefit all. All right, so the expected outcomes for an instructional framework, once it's in place, we believe that these outcomes will become common in our system. Educators will collaboratively create and use tools that support a shared understanding of excellent teaching and learning. Instructional leaders will allocate resources aligned to that framework. High quality instructional practices and observational elements for coaching and feedback will be implemented. So everyone has a clear vision of what excellent teaching and learning looks like and is able to talk about it with each other and to get feedback from each other on those practices. And then all instructional decisions will use that framework. And the framework focuses on anti-racist practices for equitable outcomes. So these would be common in a system that has a super clear, well-defined instructional framework. So some history. In our school district, we have processes for continuous improvement. So as a part of that process, our teaching, learning, and equity team, that team is Stephanie Leonard-Whitty, our Assistant Superintendent for Teaching and Learning, and our team of directors at the District Support Center, who all work together to improve teaching and learning. That team meets regularly and does deep analysis and continuous improvement work. In that work, we named specifically that the lack of a common instructional framework is one of the root causes of inequitable outcomes in our school system. And so we have taken steps to address that. We reviewed research on instructional frameworks. We interviewed leaders of other school systems who have developed these instructional frameworks and who are seeing really promising outcomes related to that work. We collected all the different types of adult learning frameworks and instructional frameworks that somehow had a connection to our school system. And there were quite a few of them. And that's actually an example of the incoherence that we're working to address. So if our new teacher mentors are working on one framework and our evaluation system is working on another framework and so on, then we're not tightly aligned and coherent as a system. And then we conducted student interviews to gather data from our students about their experiences in the school system. And we use that information from our students to inform our work. And we'll continue to gather feedback from people in our learning communities as we go forward. Now I'm going to hand it over to Kurt Mold, who's going to take it from here.
Thanks, Rick. As Rick mentioned, I'm Kurt Mold. I'm the Director of Digital Media Innovation and Strategy for the Sun Prairie Area School District. As Rick mentioned previously, we had several frameworks that were in use in various places throughout our district. These three primary frameworks, we call them, were the Ready for Rigor framework, penned by Zaretta Hammond, the Institute for Personalized Learning's Honeycomb model, and the New Teacher Center's Optimal Learning Community model. These three models incorporated some of the best work that was already in place in various locations throughout our system, but they also provided us a basis of design with visual representation. One thing that all of the great instructional frameworks have in common is that they had a visual representation. And the fact that we needed to create a visual representation was an outcome identified early on in our process. As we transition to the next slide, one of the entry points for our committee work that I will talk about here in a moment is the idea that we needed to define for Sun Prairie what exactly an instructional framework was going to be for us. And we articulated that an instructional framework is an interrelated set of systems and expectations that guide curriculum, instruction, assessment, and learning climate. It combines the specific expectations for how students learn with specific strategies and practices to guide teaching and assessment. It includes equitable multi-level systems of support, data-driven instruction, instructional expectations, professional development, lesson design, and teacher collaboration in professional learning communities. Each of these systems is influenced by the other system. And as Rick alluded to, they shape the why behind our need to have an instructional framework in Sun Prairie. That begs the question, with all of that known, where will implementation occur of our instructional framework? And as alluded to in our definition of the instructional framework, all instructional spaces in the system will be spaces where implementation will be expected to occur over time. As you can see in this slide, the design team had committed to almost a year's worth of work in creating the initial visual representation of our instructional framework. After things were defined regarding our instructional framework, and after we moved forward with the initial planning for our various models and primary resources, the instructional framework design team leveraged the resources we had available, in addition to the student interviews, which Rick previously referred to, and over a series of several meetings, developed the instructional framework. One of the outcomes of the instructional framework is the expectation that the instructional framework will fulfill fully the mission and vision of our school district. And just to remind our viewers that the vision for our school district is to be recognized as a high-performing district of choice that reflects the cultures of our diverse community, and that we strive to inspire and prepare every child every day by providing relevant, engaging, and innovative learning experiences in and out of the classroom. Our work in Sun Prairie related to the instructional framework is further driven by our board-adopted equity statement. I will pause here and allow viewers and board members to take a moment to read the equity statement. Thank you. As we move on, we're also driven by our core values in our district. And we value the diversity of our community, the experience and wisdom that each child brings to the learning community. We believe in providing a welcome, safe, and nurturing environment, in supporting social, emotional, and academic needs of every child to help them reach their full potential. We believe in inspiring our students and workforce to be lifelong learners, that developing critical thinking and analytical skills will prepare students to become engaged and productive citizens. We believe in teaching ethical behavior and modeling character, in creating a passion for teaching and learning, and preparing students to thrive in a dynamic future. That we value and support a highly qualified, diverse, and culturally responsive workforce. We believe that collaborative partnerships with students, parents, teachers, staff, businesses, and the greater community will lead to educational excellence. And we believe continuous improvement in the pursuit of excellence. From here on out, you will continue to hear how those values and belief statements, our commitment to equity, and our mission and vision play out in the development of our instructional frameworks. Our process began with an analysis of existing frameworks, and you can see here a visual representation of a word cloud, which takes the most frequently used words in each of those documents. And the most frequently used words in the documents that we were reviewing included representation, relationships, inclusivity, that work and student learning was relevant, and that the student would be focused and centered. As we continued to examine frameworks and continued to keep the mission and vision and belief statements centered in our work, the examination of our frameworks showed us that really we should be prioritizing 3 frameworks as a basis of design for our work moving forward. These were not the only frameworks that we looked at. The previous frameworks mentioned were the honeycomb model, the Ready for Rigor framework, and the optimal learning community model. But we also looked at the gradual release of responsibility model. We drew from AVID, which should be familiar to all of us, or advancement via individual determination, which is a program and services and supports that exist in our schools for students seeking to go to college. We have schools in our system that have utilized universal design for learning principles. And we, of course, use the framework for teaching, or the Danielson model, throughout our system. We also have done work with staff on authentic intellectual work. And we've also looked at the Center for Anti-Racist Instructional Frameworks, which became available in the middle of our process. And we didn't use any one of these frameworks as the basis of design. And instead, we took the best of, used the equity and belief statements, our mission and vision, to filter the elements of those frameworks that really felt like they rose to the top for the members of our design team. Ultimately, our design team needed to wrestle with a common set of questions, and the idea that those interrelated set of systems and expectations that guide our curriculum, instruction, assessment, and learning climate would be driven by denoting specifically expectations for how students learn, for articulating specific strategies and practices to guide teaching, and the specific strategies to guide assessment. So in the beginning of this presentation, we've thrown a lot of introductory material at the viewer, and I'd invite you now to press pause. Feel free to return to previous slides to review anything, to take notes. And as I transition to my colleague, Sarah, she will talk to us about how the process unfolded around creating a visual representation and ultimately what became the final draft of our instructional framework.
Thanks, Kurt. As Kurt alluded to, creating a visual representation is one key component of any instructional framework. And I just want to also make mention that if you are listening to this screencast on your mobile device, There is the slide deck that accompanies the screencast that's also included in board docs. And we're going to be looking at some pictures coming up here that are drawn and denoted right from our community. And so if you want to pull them up on a computer or a larger screen, there's some really great photographs that capture the process that we went through over the course of several meetings. So we knew that to create our first team visual, we were going to take all of that information that Kurt just shared. Those priority frameworks, the priority framework feedback workbook, which was essentially a place for our different design team members to put their feedback on what they were reading and what were the important pieces that were being lifted up, and our instructional lenses. And it's important to note that our design team was a representative sample of our community here in Sun Prairie. We had students, we had educators, support staff, administrators from the buildings, administrators from our central office, representation across elementary, middle school, and high school. We had board members, community members, parents and caregivers. And so there were a lot of different lenses that were brought to the table to create and synthesize all of that information into this instructional framework visual representation. So our guidance was that we would first create teams with no more than 4 other team members so that we could keep the groups manageable enough to be able to synthesize all that into a visual representation. Then the teams would identify the common themes and differences of the visuals that each individual had made. Then we would collaborate with other teams to create visuals, and we were using some language around buckets and descriptors, which I'll show you here in just a moment. And so there were 5 groups, and each of the 5 groups had a large piece of chart paper and took all of that information, our vision, our mission, our values, the priority frameworks review, and had to synthesize that into these key terms. So we landed on the terms buckets and descriptors in the beginning here, and the buckets would be the large titles, or what we are now calling themes. And the descriptors were literally the phrases, sentences, or notes about the important pieces that aligned to each of those buckets or themes. And so we were calling those descriptors, and we're now calling those elements. So I'll use both of these terms. So what you can see on these 2 visual displays here, visual 1, they had 3 different buckets with the descriptors around the outside and students in the middle. Visual 2, they had 6 different buckets with their descriptors listed under each. This is groups 3 and 4. Group 3 sort of did like a fountain array. They had 6 different buckets. They also used the letters to make an acronym and had those students in the center. Group 4 took our Sun Prairie logo and used that to position 8 different buckets and the descriptors listed there with students in the center. And group 5 also had like a visual representation that was similar to our graphic logo, had students in the center, and then 4 different buckets with those descriptors. So we put all of those posters next to each other and we said, what are the recurring features, or what do we see the same on all of these different graphics? And we saw that all of the graphics had students or student outcomes at the center. Most of them actually had students drawn, or the word students right at the center. That they weren't a list of bucketed items, rather there was like this notion of interconnectivity. So everything was interconnected and not linear and not sequential. And then third, the descriptors, the buckets, all of the language was really public friendly, meaning language that would be common and easy to understand, even if you weren't a person who worked within the educational system. So then, in our TLE team, our Teaching, Learning, and Equity team here of directors, and with our assistant superintendent, we took a purple Post-it note and transferred over the bucket titles. So on this poster, for example, there were those 6 bucket titles. We copied over each title onto a purple Post-it note. And then we took all of those headings from all 5 posters and put them up on the board and started to sort and categorize like terms. And so these buckets became common groupings. And here you can see we had a social emotional wellness theme, an inclusive environments theme, a teaching, learning, or curriculum instruction and assessment theme, a partnership theme, and a cultural responsiveness or awareness theme. And so we had 5-ish groupings that when we then kind of stepped back, we were able to see that social emotional wellness and inclusive environments really we were very similar in those concepts being arranged with the learning environment. We also then looked at teaching, learning, curriculum, instruction, assessment, and learning partnerships, and thought about that being part of the learning experience that our students would have in our district. And then culturally responsiveness and awareness became a theme around learning for equity. And so we ended up with like terms and like sounding short themes or buckets of learning environment, learning experiences, and learning for equity. We then took each of the descriptors, the small print that was on each of those posters, and we typed it into a spreadsheet. We noted in column B the poster that the language came from, and then we worked to align and color code which of those descriptors matched those themes. So for example, one of the descriptors from poster 3 had said, enriching, safe, innovative, warm and friendly and engaging. And that aligned with this theme of having a supportive environment, all under the learning environment. Restorative, joyful, balance of care, and high expectations all came from poster 1. And so those 4 descriptors came together with this title of supportive environments. And as you can see, this is a screenshot of a spreadsheet where we had this same about number of descriptors for learning environment, a separate tab for learning experiences, a separate tab for learning for equity, and then a few other descriptors that didn't necessarily fit one of these 3 main categories or were just kind of one-off ideas. And so for example, in learning environment, you can see now that we, under column C, have 4 different elements that we are aligning to this theme of learning environment. We then took those elements or those descriptions on the outside and put them with those themes. So under learning for equity, you see there were 3 different descriptors of honoring diversity, cultural competence, and awareness and action for equity. Those 3 align to learning for equity. We had 5 of those color-coded elements that align to learning experiences, and 4 of those color-coded elements or descriptors that align to the learning environment. We also played off the idea of things being interrelated and having it be in a circle, as that seemed to combine the flavor of all of the different displays that were created by our teams, and we put our students at the center with every child every day. So in this visual, the inner ring became those buckets, the outer ring became the descriptions. And it's also important to note that the instructional design team felt very strongly that this tool needed to be something that was usable and interactive, meaning this would be a place where educators could go or where community members could go to see what does it mean if I'm honoring diversity? What does that mean? What would professional development be available to me if I wanted to grow in that area? Where could I see videos of that happening in our schools in best practices? And how could I essentially get to a place where, as if I'm an educator, I'm sustaining my practice in all of these different areas? And so that was another key component that we knew that if we built this 2D graphic, we would need to also have something else that would become more interactive. So all of that information, we worked with our good people in our communications department, and they put together this first draft visual. So this was on January 31st. This is the draft. You can see from that paper representation, it was in our color themes of the red, orange, and yellow. You can see the learning for equity, those 3 descriptors of honoring diversity, cultural competence, awareness, and action for equity, 4 descriptors in learning environment, 5 descriptors in learning experiences. And we took this visual back to our instructional framework design team and asked for their feedback on it. And so back in our small groups, we worked to give our feedback around the layout, the content, and any proposed changes that we wanted to see. And from that, that feedback was given to TLE. It was a critical juncture at the end of January 31st, where we took a vote among our instructional design team to say, should we keep going and keep refining? Or would you like to hand this over to our teaching, learning, and equity team to do that further refinement after getting some community feedback? And the team voted for it to be handed over to our teaching, learning, and equity team after that final community feedback. So this is the point where in our TLE team, we took all that feedback from our design team, and essentially you can see we dropped the learning for in the center ring and became our themes of equity, experiences, and environment. You can see that the descriptors on the outside, some were very similar, and so the team felt there were a couple that could have been combined together, and it would also be visually appealing to land upon this rule of threes. So you see 3 descriptors or elements in each of the 3 themes, the themes being those inner terms or buckets, the elements being those outer terms or descriptors. At that point, we took all of the information, we had a slide deck with some of this information in it, made a screencast, and sent this out to our community, asking for feedback in March. And our caregivers were able to give us some feedback on the instructional design and the visual that we had in place. And through that feedback, we landed on the March version, which you can see here, we have equity essentially undergirding all that we do. So equity is positioned here at the bottom. We have experiences and environment at the top, and the red, orange, and yellow flow around with our Every Child, Every Day still at the center. Between then and now, we've taken the logo back to our communications department, and they have added visual wayfinding icons to our 2D chart. So you can see there's going to be a visual representation for each of our 9 elements. And we've also changed the font to be in line with our Sun Prairie Area School District title for a more aesthetically pleasing to the eye. And separately, we are also working on building that interactive website that our instructional design team called for. So this is the opening slide of that framework, and what it is we would click on the view the framework, and then it leads you to this interactive space where we are building out the content right now. And as we work to create more content with our educators here in our district, this will become a place for people to go to be able to actualize the different elements and themes of this framework. That was definitely a lot of information. Again, I would invite you at this time to pause. If you have it up on a computer, to go back and walk through and see that evolution. It was definitely a comprehensive process and very collaborative and meaningful to our community. With that, I'm going to pass it to my colleague, Rick.
Thanks, Sarah. So now we're going to talk about what are our next steps. So entry points into this work, engaging, right? Up until now, it was about design and bringing our community together to determine what the instructional framework would look like. Now that it's established, we need to find entry points into how will we interface our system that's got all kinds of work going in different areas, and how will we bring everyone together to engage with this instructional framework. So the first most important thing to acknowledge is that implementation of an instructional framework is not something that happens quickly. It's a 5 to 10 year journey of work to implement something like this well. We know this because it's really comprehensive in nature, and we know this by interacting with other school systems who have done similar work. So this work will not happen overnight. However, we decided that our teaching, learning, and equity team would work with school leaders across the system to start to identify what components of the instructional framework, of the 9 components around the outer ring, what components of that framework would make sense as entry points. And when thinking about that, well, what is the work that we've already named, or what is the work that schools have already been working to improve and to get better at, and what does that align with, so it doesn't feel like a significant stop and start of the work. So we've been engaged in that. Also, our leadership collaborative, which is all of our principals, associate principals, and coordinators, other instructional leaders across the system, have been invited to help us create what we're calling practice profiles. And so that work is happening this summer in teams across multiple days, so that we will get really clear and granular about what each of those components, the elements around the outer part of the instructional framework, what they mean. Our teaching, learning, and equity team will identify the elements to incorporate the instructional framework into the district scorecard. So that's happened for this coming school year, 2022-23. Those 3 elements that will be cascaded to site scorecards and prioritized for initial implementation are rigorous and coherent teaching, culture of care, and disrupting inequity. So those are the areas that will get focused first. And then site leaders will incorporate this into the strategic actions on their scorecards, in their SAIL plans or continuous improvement efforts, and into the work with their other site leadership teams in the buildings. So, and then finally, our teaching, learning, and equity team communicates progress back to the team that designed the instructional framework in the first place. So we want our community to see that we're living out the work that we began last year. Along with all of this on that slide, our teaching, learning, and equity team, our directors, are going to be partnering as coaches, implementation coaches, with our school teams. So just want to name that. So how will we strategically implement such a robust framework? Again, we engaged with site leaders and district-wide coordinators to get their input. And again, here are those 3 elements that were named as the starting point for the next 2 years: rigorous and coherent teaching and learning, culture of care, and disrupting inequity. So those, again, will show up in all of our scorecards, in our continuous improvement plans. These are going to be where our focus is really for the next 2 years. And again, we're coaching schools and implementing those over the next 6 100-day plans. So our continuous improvement happens in short cycles of 100 days at a time. And so we'll make sure each of those 100 days, we're making progress on these elements. All right, one other just note here on how we go about implementation. So we're taking some of the best practices in implementation research and implementation in science from a national organization called NIRN. It's the National Implementation Research Network. And we know, like, a framework is beautiful, the framework is nice, but if we don't do a solid job with implementation, it won't make the impact that we desire, right? So we have the effective innovation, that's the instructional framework. We're working to better define the details of that. That times effective implementation, which is where we spell out the details and we have conversations and we coach people in our system on instructional practices in all 9 elements. And then we have where that work occurs. That's the enabling context, where that work occurs. And as Kurt mentioned earlier, that's all instructional spaces in the system. So this is not optional work. This is where we are all in in all instructional spaces and implementing this over the next several years. And those all multiplied times each other equal our Y. If we do all of those well, then we will achieve the Y, which is, again, the common instructional framework leading to coherent instructional programs, which will result in the reduction or elimination of disproportionality in student achievement outcomes for Black, Brown, and other historically marginalized students, essentially resulting in all students are doing better than they are right now, including elimination of disproportionality. All right, so that's how we're going about implementation. The next part of that is that defining the practice profiles work. And this is our plan for this summer. It's already underway. So we have teams of people who are working with our teaching, learning, and equity team across dates in June and July to further define in detail, what does rigorous and coherent teaching mean? What does a culture of care mean? And what does disrupting inequity mean in Sun Prairie, so that we can implement those well over the next 2 years. All right. And with that, that brings us to the end of our presentation. I want to thank my partners, Kurt and Sarah, for joining and creating the screencast. I want to thank all of you for taking the time and effort to view and consume this information. And we look forward to engaging with you to hear your feedback, and also to be able to engage in conversation, answer any questions that you have at the upcoming school board meeting. All right. Thanks, everyone. Take care.